continue our conversation on technology that you've kind of come across or that's new.
Okay, as I was telling you, in the 1950s, any kind of electronic devices were done with vacuum tubes. But during that decade is when the first transistors were invented. The transistors, we hear about solid state electronics, where you actually have crystals of solid material that can control, where you can have one current or a voltage that controls another current. A small current can control a large current, and you have an amplifier. So those were invented, though they were individual little pieces and they were expensive. As people learned how to manufacture them in more mass quantities, they got cheaper. Also in the 1950s, something very interesting happened as the people invented the first lasers, which were also very expensive. So it's a lot of things that we take for granted. When I was a freshman in high school, we had to learn how to write a term paper, do a research paper at the library. So I wrote mine on lasers, which nobody else in this whole school knew anything about. I was very interested in electronics and that kind of thing. So
that's interesting too.
In the 1960s, people learned to make the first integrated circuits that you could take a single chip of silicon and put multiple transistors on the thing, so you could have a whole device on a single, as they would say, chip. Now, okay, and then the scale of that really increased in the 1970s. That is, how much you could put on, the idea that you could have a simple central processor for a computer on a single chip. When I was studying computer science at Michigan, they were the prophets of thinking about what's going to happen in the future. They imagined that this was about 1981, something like that, that someday, the computers, most of the computers that people had were things that took up good chunks of a building. You had air conditioning and so on. So there was a whole building on U of M's North Campus that was the computer center. And you had one floor where people could go in and put in data and so forth, and the whole up machinery on the upper stair. Just a big chunk of machinery, all right? And they were saying, okay, so someday we'll be able to have, by the first programs I wrote were on punch cards. We'll have a computer that has a megabyte of memory and a megapixel, and that's the pixels are the little dots that make up a digital picture. And it'll do a million a megaflop, they call it, floating point operations per second. And it'll all fit in the size of a school lunchbox. Well, Fib's lunchbox. And that would be, people could conceive of that. The guy there's a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, which no longer exists, partly because they couldn't visualize this happening, and that people would actually have computers in their houses. And he said, why would anybody want to do that?
Yeah. Now this thing's basically
and
a computer.
you have that little device there that's recording that can do much more than that. They call it the 3M machine, the megapixel, the mega floating point and flop, and the million memory locations. So you have in there, I bet you, something like 16 gigabytes of memory, right?
That's true.
Okay, which is 10 to the 9th, and we're, as opposed to 1 million, 10 to the 6th, you have 16 times 10 to the 9th, so you have 16,000 times more memory than what the futurists were even imagining at that time. And that little screen of yours has more than 1 million pixels in it. And it
Well, that's
fits in
pretty-
something smaller than a lunchbox.
Yeah.
And it does more than the central processor, it does much more than 1 million operations per second.
Yeah. Pretty neat stuff.
So,